things to think about when we're thinking about the complexity of student mental health and looking today about some of the risk and protective factors. And I'm delighted that Etna was before me because she actually reminded me of some of the things we used to talk about and include in slide, which is particularly the development of the brain. So, which is wonderful to see that that's there, and also the emergence of when mental health difficulties begin. So, firstly, I thought I'd start with this definition, and it does speak to some of the things about the importance of the person within their context. So mental health is defined as a state of well-being in which every individual realises their own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, because there are stresses in life no matter what, can cope and can work productively and fruitfully and make a contribution to their community. So for students, it's making a contribution to their community. So I think that's a really nice place to start, to think about that. And I think also Etna was thinking about, when we talk about, we do know we have mental health difficulties, we do know we are a place where we can support that, but we also need to not lose sight that many of our students are actually doing well and flourishing. So it is within that whole context. So now this is, why would we focus on youth mental health? Firstly, we know that around 25% of the total global population is comprised of young people 10 to 24, that age we talked about, Etna referred to earlier. In Ireland, around 13% approximately are aged between 15 and 24, CSO stats 2023. And we do know that adolescence and young adulthood is a peak time for the onset of mental health difficulties. And more importantly, 75% of mental health difficulties that persist in adulthood have emerged before 25. It's a key time that if we can intervene and have it, there may be a better long-term prognosis. On the left-hand side, I have, this is the demographics from right up to, there's a whole series of ages, I can't really, years over here. But if you look, see there's a bulge in the middle, like that big fat waist, okay? Underneath that, that's in around, that's where we currently are. And if you look at kind of where the waist is in a bit, that's kind of where our current ages are. But the next bulge coming down like a hip, let's call it that, they're 12-year-olds, okay? Now we know that these 12-year-olds 6 years from now are going to be coming into us. So there's going to be another big surge of students coming in. So we need to be also prepared for that in terms of our capacity to actually manage within our system. And they're Irish data. So I am going to talk about data from the My World survey, which some of you may know about, but I'll talk a little bit more in a moment. But why would we do that? If you look at this graph here, see where the kind of the yellowy part of the graph. This, if you look at that and see the bounds between around, say, early teens to about 25, you have a peak around 20. That's when we have the peak of mental health difficulties. And when Etna presented the data about the average age, that 20 is approximately the average age of our undergraduate community. That's when mental health difficulties actually are at their peak. So it's not, I suppose, a surprise that we see them in our community, because Tim started this morning saying 65% of our second level students will progress to third level. So this is where we're going to see it. If we're going to see mental health difficulties, it's going to be in our communities. So that's why we need to have that context as well. Then looking at, why is it important that we do this? Why do we look at mental health? Why do we focus on it? Not only from an individual perspective, but also from an economic perspective. So if you look at this, quite a lot of studies being done looking at the lost economic output by disease type. So these are the non-communicable diseases. So 35% of lost economic output is due to mental health. That's the biggest of all contributing factors. Cardiovascular is around 33, and cancer is 20-something. So if you look at that, the key take-home from this is mental health is the #1 reason why we've lost economic output. So there is a reason why we focus on it, particularly within the context of our third level system, because this is when we have the majority of those, when this peak is likely to happen. So a little bit of background about the My World study. So we do know that higher education is associated with several stresses and transitional events. So transitioning in, transitioning through, transitioning out. And they're really important. And also, so these transitions are at a time when mental health problems are at their developmental peak. So you've got these multiple things going on at the same time. And as I've said, the majority of mental health disorders occur before the age of 24. The top two mental health difficulties that we are likely to see are depression and anxiety. Certainly when I did the study in 1920, it was then. And I know from working with the different services across Ireland in terms of the database that we talked about a few, in terms of it's something I'm working with the HEA in terms of working with all of the college counselling services to gather data at a national level. The data coming out of that still says depression and anxiety are at the top. These are the top mental health difficulties we're likely to see in our community of students. Now, there are significant gaps in research data looking at the prevalence and nature of mental health. There are gaps here. And one of the big gaps is there's little evidence comparing cohorts. And this is the study one of the reasons why the work that we did was important is that we, at a particular time, we collected data right across Ireland, but we collected it across all different cohorts, allowing us to have some understanding as to what extent is being in a particular cohort likely to, are you likely to have different types of mental health difficulties emerge from that. So, and also there's a lot of reports coming out now saying that PhD candidates have elevated mental health difficulties. Now, often when you read about that, they're not actually looked at in the broader student context. They're often looked at in their own right. So to what extent is it the PhD or is it not? So we have to, sometimes having data across cohorts help us understand what's actually happening. Other groups of students, those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds and international students from the data appear to have a greater risk than those that we might call, for the want of a not a very useful term, traditional routes of coming, straight through school and on into third level education. So a little bit about Wild World Survey 2. I'm not going to go into a lot of the methodologies, just to say some of the data I'm going to present here. We've got a sample size around 10,000, so nice, robust sample to work from. 69% female, that's a problem. Whenever we do surveys, women are more likely to step up and do it. I'm looking around this room, which is also somewhat gendered. So, I mean, this is a space we work on, which is an issue. The mean age, 20.3, that absolute peak where mental health difficulties are likely to be. In this particular group, 90% Irish, 87% undergraduates, 7% came through a HEA route, which is those for disability. 7% were through the disadvantaged route, DARE. 76% identified as heterosexual, 18% LGBAP, 6% questioning or prefer not to say. So what do we find? Some findings. So, and everybody will say, oh, this data is a couple of years old. I'm sure it's worse than now. I'm sure it is worse now, potentially. We don't know that yet. We are planning a My World Survey 3, which I might get to at the very end. But just to tell you what this is, what we were, and there is still evidence from other studies that this is quite comparable. So the data that are being published after this are still very, very comparable to these. So looking firstly at depression, we find that 58% are outside the normal range for depression. That's a lot. Now, what's normal? So we use the depression and anxiety and stress scale. It's a well-validated measure. We found this to be validated for this particular sample as well and cohort. And so that we can kind of stand over these. With regard to depression, we didn't find that there was any gender. So we didn't find males or females particularly different. In some of the variables, we did see gender, but not for depression. However, when we looked at anxiety, there was a strong gender effect where females were exhibiting higher levels of anxiety in comparison to males. But again, 48% were outside the normal range for anxiety. That's a lot. So that's quite a lot of our students. But down at the end of the severe and very severe, that's kind of the more worrying end. The mild and normal mild will be okay. Moderate, probably quite modifiable. But when you have students in the severe and the very severe, these are more worrying students. So with regard to females, you've got around 32% in that space, about a third, which is actually quite high. And again, over 25% of males. Suicidality, this was a particularly concerning, so we did ask about suicidal behaviours. And firstly, we had looking at those about whether they'd ever thought about taking their life, although they wouldn't do it. And here we had 66% who said that, and 35% of that within the last year. Looking at those who've ever deliberately hurt themselves, but without wanting to take their own life, and we find we have around 38% females, more likely at 42% in comparison to males at 22%. And when we looked at those who had deliberately hurt themselves, so this is deliberately hurting them, wanting to take their own life, we have a worrying 12%, 14% females and 8% male. And then at a suicide attempt, 10% had made a suicide attempt, 23% within the past year, 11% of those in the last 6 months, and 5% of those within the last month. So there's a quite a risky group of people within our and the interesting thing, if I took this data and I looked at a different institution, I didn't see a pattern. So one institution didn't differ pattern-wise to others. So it's not like, a whole load of them said got together, so we're all gonna, we're gonna make ourselves look really bad on this. I think there is a stability and a robustness to the data that we can stand over. Looking at our stressors then, surprise, surprise. What do they say? College, future, and finance. So being worried now, if you think about being worried about the future a number of years ago, look at what's happened since then. There's been a climate crisis, accommodation crisis, cost of living crisis, all of those. So no doubt, even this will be more exaggerated than we currently found the last time. So, and then we find that 37% reported being often stressed by their current situation. Females more likely report this at 54%, and 12% were highly stressed, and 40% felt pressured to work outside of college. Now, I can imagine that would even be higher again now because of the cost of living crisis, and 25% found that they were very stressed by this, and females were more likely to report it than males. Looking at, and I thought I'd kind of go into some of the things that were positive. What's really important? Sleep. And sleep hygiene. So we found there was looking at what's recommended. It's recommended for this age or for adults to get between 7 and 9 hours sleep a night, which is recommended. 62% of students reported that they did get that required sleep. Here I have a slide linking sleep, recommended sleep, and depression. So the blue bars are those that are getting the recommended sleep. So you can see they're more likely to be in the normal range for depression and less likely to be in the very severe, versus those that aren't getting the recommended sleep. Sleep is really important. And those that have good sleep hygiene, this was linked to higher resilience. So we did, because we measured and looked at resilience, some of the protective factors, self-esteem, optimism, social support, and lower anxiety. So kind of all those good positive things that we want to see. And I think one of the things we in UCD, the students are often asking us to have a 24-hour library. And I think that is the case in some institutions, but I'm not saying anything about others, but I'm saying UCD has been asked, and I say we shouldn't do that. Sleep is key. If we have a 24-hour library, we're sending the message, sleep doesn't matter, sleep matters. So, and I know why students want access to libraries, so I understand that, but I also think we need to consider the importance and relevance of sleep. Again, looking at physical activity. So again, it's trying to link those positive things. So it's about health, going back to where we were today. It's all of these things are about health and living well. So looking at physical activity, and again, we had to look at how often they got moderate exercise for so many hours a week, etc. There was a formula then, and we were able to categorize those that were getting the recommended level of physical activity and those that weren't. When we looked at that, we found that those getting the recommended level of physical activity were doing better than those, and the bars are slipped those who weren't. So they were more likely to have normal depression, etc. So physical activity, good physical activity recommended was lower depression, anxiety, lower problem drinking, which was an interesting one. We used the alcohol use disorders identification test. Higher self-esteem, optimism, resilience, body esteem. So you can begin to see this pattern of positivity being linked to positive things that are linked to our physical well-being as well. Sexual consent. So we've seen there's been made reference to the consent framework. So when we were doing My World Survey 2, we worked closely with the psychological counsellors of higher education in Ireland, as well as students in terms of the co-creation of this survey. One of the things that emerged from that was the importance of including questions on sexual consent, which we did, and pornography. So these next two slides are going to look at that. So we're looking at sexual consent. 47% had reported they'd been touched against their will. Females reported this, and they were more likely to report this than males, at 56% for females. 20% reported they'd been forced or pressured to have sex, and females reported it was higher at 25% and then males at 10%. When we then begin to link these sexual consent or lack of consent to mental health indicators, we saw that for both males and females who reported to have been touched against their will, they were more likely to be not in the normal range for anxiety and depression, and more likely to be in the severe or very severe range. And again, if for males and females reported to being forced or pressured to have sex, the pattern was the same, but even stronger. So there was a stronger pattern. Anything I tell you here is statistically significant, but I didn't think you'd be interested in the stats, so you can just take it as a given, okay, I'm not telling you anything that hasn't an evidence behind it. Okay, then moving on to the suicidality piece, which is even more concerning. So again, looking at those who'd been touched against their will, they were more likely to report a deliberate self-harm, wanting to take their life, and have made a suicide attempt at some point. And again, for both males and females who had been pressured or forced, the pattern was the same and strong. And just to give you an example, so looking at made a suicide attempt at some point, for males who had been forced, that was 18%, and those males who hadn't, that was 7%, and for females, that was 21%, and for females who hadn't been forced, that was 7%. So you can see the gap on that. Pornography. Then looking again, the college councillors felt this is something you need to be asking about. These are important. So we did. So we asked about pornography. So 65% reported ever watching pornography, and 96% had searched for sites themselves. And then looking at that within the past month, 73% of males and 17% of females reported once a week or more. So it's much more likely to be a male-related activity than female. And 23% of males and 62% of females 2 to 3 times per month. So there is a prevalence even within males, but not the frequency isn't as high. When we looked at those who watched pornography weekly, and they were likely to have lower self-esteem, lower body esteem. Body esteem came up earlier, talking about the importance of that. And then if we link just the graph on the right-hand side here, linking the severity of depression just for females, because we didn't see this link for males, just emerged for females, that we saw that where we had, if you've never or less than once or twice a week, or once or twice a week or more, looking at that frequency of looking at pornography, that there was a link with depression. So particularly if you look at the very severe, those who were more frequent engagers with pornography by females, their level of depression was. Now, the why of this we don't know, but it's sometimes. It isn't always, you don't have to always know the why. Just sometimes knowing things are there just helps us to kind of create a form of story or an understanding of people and their behaviours. Sexual orientation, 76% identified themselves as heterosexual, and sexual orientation was linked to both depression and anxiety. So those who identify particularly as LGBT or questioning had higher levels of reported anxiety and depression. And again, there is a graph on the left-hand side. So the blue are those who identify as heterosexual, and so there's a much higher proportion of those in the normal range for. And again, the why. When we don't know, is it that they, are they disconnected? Do they not have a tribe, or they're maybe not as accepted by who? The why isn't the thing, but it is the vulnerability, and that's an important thing for us to. So I think when we're meeting with students, trying to think about the lens of where they're coming from is a really important piece to understanding their journey. Talking about problems, this is considered to be very important. 40% reported they did not talk about their problems. Why? Why have we got 40% of students saying they're not talking about their problems? And that isn't talking to anybody in the counselling. That's actually keeping to themselves and not actually talking. And males were much more likely to say this than females. But we do know, because we did quite a lot of analysis on comparing those who talk and don't talk. Now, those univariate analysis in their own right, because there's all the drivers going in behind that as well. But it did point to the fact that if students say they do talk, they seem to have much better profile in terms of protective factors. And they do talk to their friends, they talk to family, and so they do reach out. When they're reaching out to their close community, and often not the the broader community. Now, a lot of the work we did, this was work that I did with Jigsaw, and our very, very first study back in 2012 pointed to a really strong protective factor of what we called the one good adult at the time. So I thought it'd be useful to look at this, because it actually came up last week about the one good adult, and I hadn't even included a slide, so I'll put it in this week. Because this is quite an important thing, is the sense of the one good adult. Is there one good adult in your life that actually can support you? And we found, on the left-hand side, if you look, there is looking at depression. So in this case, the light blue is where you've got that high support. So you're much more likely to be in the normal range for depression if you've got this high support from one good adult, and less likely to be in the very severe. But not only is it linked to something like your mental health, it's also linked to very positive things. So if you've high support from one good adult, you're much more likely to report higher levels of life satisfaction, self-esteem, resilience, optimism, social support, all of these protective factors. And low support was linked to much higher engagement in drug use and illicit drug use, and possible alcohol dependence. So some very negative behavior. So that being that disconnected, we've had a lot of conversation about community and building communities and how important that is. But even sometimes, even the one person within that community can be a very important person. So it could be the lecturer that you can approach. It can be whoever. It can be in the library. It doesn't, as long as there's that sense. And that, again, when I was talking to the career counsellors last week, they brought that up, that where there is, sometimes they will, as in a career counselling session, what will emerge are mental health difficulties, and just that they become that point of the one good adult. So that we are interconnected in our communities. So a spotlight on cohorts. So looking very briefly at the undergraduate, the postgraduate, and the postgraduate PGT, postgraduate taught, PGR, postgraduate researchers. So that could be the researcher or PhDs. So our undergraduates have lower self-esteem, body esteem, optimism, and planned coping than either the postgraduate taught or the postgraduate researchers, and they engage in more risky alcohol behaviour. Surprise, surprise. Going back to the limbic system and taking risk, that's what they're going to do at 18 and 19. It's part of what the constellation of behaviours. Then looking at anxiety, depression, and avoidant coping. So the undergraduates, again, have higher anxiety, higher depression, these are significant, and higher avoidant coping. Avoidant coping is this one where you put your head in the sand and won't engage with the problem you have. So you're playing a bit of ostrich. And this is, and that we found that the avoidant coping was linked to a whole series of constellation of more negative mental health indicators. So I thought it'd be interesting to look at, well, kind of, is it undergraduate, is it the status of the student, or is it an age thing? So on the left-hand side, you'll see that plots the undergraduates, postgraduate taught, postgraduate research for depression and anxiety. So you can see as you move between your undergraduate to postgraduate research, they significantly drop. But if I plot this against age, I get a similar type of pattern. So you've got 18 to 20-year-olds highest, and 31 plus right down below. So I'm not sure it's really linked to the status. It's very linked to that very starting graph where you've got this peak at 20. So that it's one of the key indicators is age, rather than necessarily being that they're undergraduates or otherwise. And we get the very same type of thing. These are protective factors. You'll see. And we've got here we've got our social support goes up quite a lot, when we're and also what we got on the other side of the self-esteem. These all again tend to increase, and the very same pattern emerges if I use this against age. So so again it's to be careful that we've got two things covariating. And anyone knows anything about stats, things that covary you can't actually decide which is which. So is it an age, or is it whether they're undergraduates or postgraduates? Then looking at a little bit about student cohort, and looking at the DARE, the disability route. So those that came through a disability route, they profile more negatively. And I don't want to pathologize people coming through a disability route, but it is important for us to understand that they may actually report a more elevated distress and other areas. So they were more likely to report severe anxiety and severe depression versus those who were non-DARE. So for example, 28% versus 17%, 21% versus 12%. But more worrying that their suicidal behaviours were significantly elevated. So a suicide attempt rated 28% versus 9%. And they were lower on self-esteem, life satisfaction, optimism, and overall total support. And a similar pattern for those coming through the socioeconomic route to higher education access route. And these are obviously undergraduates only, because these are tagged through our system. And again, higher anxiety and depression, higher suicide, and lower in self-esteem, life satisfaction, optimism, and total support. So this profile of a more vulnerable group of students coming through. So the importance of those coming through these access routes to be really supported into our institutions, to make sure that our access and lifelong learning, that's what we call it in UCD, each of you will have your own units, how important that they are resourced well to support students, because they're really important. Diversity is an important part of our community, and we want diversity in our community, but if we have diversity, we have to be able to support our diversity, the diversity that comes into our community. Now, this is kind of busy, so the slides are going to be available, I think. Are you going to do that? So don't worry about it. I just thought we also looked at the data in other ways. So we also looked at traditional entry are those who come through at 18 through the regular Leaving Cert. We have our HEA students, our DARE students, but we also looked at those that were mature, students who came through the mature pathway. The one thing we found is the mature pathway and the traditional entry were more similar than those who came through either the HEA or the DARE pathway. The HEA and the DARE pathways they had more elevated distress and lower level of protection than either of the other two groups. So in the last couple of slides, what we were doing is I was looking much more at percentages, using things like a non-parametric analysis to find differences. Whereas this is where we used parametric analysis using means, and so it was a slightly different analysis. But the message is that traditional entry students tend to actually looking at those that are different, particularly from our HEA and DARE. And this is just at our undergraduate. This is leaving out our postgraduate community, whether they're taught a postgraduate research, just focusing in on the undergraduate community. So and again, the mature students, they are older often, so they may not be as exhibiting some of the elevations that particular undergraduates might be. So the point being is that we do have significant differences, right? And on this here, you'll find traditional entry and mature were less than here in the DARE. So in other words, depression was less, anxiety was less. Then alcohol use for traditional and entry and mature was higher than the others. No differences in drug use. Avoidant behaviour, that the traditional entry and mature had less avoidance than the DARE students. The problem-focused, coping, mature were higher than traditional entry, who were higher than the HEA, who were higher than the DARE. So there's kind of a pattern emerging here. And problem-focused is where you actually sit down. I've got a problem. I'm going to find a problem. I'm going to find a solution. Resilience, life satisfaction. So there's similar patterns emerging there, and the means. But this is too busy a slide, I think. But I just thought if you have it afterwards, you can have a look at it. Looking at the top stressors and coping. So what are the stressors? We looked at those earlier. I want to zone in more on what specific postgraduate research is, because there is quite a lot of work going on now. So what are they saying? Supervision. Anybody who works with in this area of postgraduate space, you're looking at to what extent are supervisors, what are we doing in terms of good supervisory training? We know obviously stipends are an issue. Now they are raised, so that would be an issue for cost of housing. Isolation, everybody who knows, if you work in that PhD community, they regularly talk about isolation. Mental health, self-esteem, and I think that self-esteem there might linked into the imposter syndrome. You know, this idea that this emerged that, am I good enough to be doing this? And time demands, thesis, etc. In terms of coping, the postgraduate researchers use friends, exercise, talking, sleep, taking time out, kind of mature, and ways of managing your stress. And your anxieties. Postgraduate taught use friends, talking, exercise and sleep, and undergraduates tend to use friends, music and sleep. And this all emerged from the different types of analysis. So these are the mechanisms by which they're actually, but friends are actually a thread that goes right through this. So that's the importance of your tribe. You know, Coleman, you say your tribe at the very beginning. So that's another way of talking about our tribe. That if you've got your tribe, that's going to be part of your coping mechanism. And then I'm going to finish now in a moment. Left-hand slide, forget it. I wanted to just contextualize this, and the whole day has been about frameworks. So, and there's been a lot of, we've heard about the National Suicide, Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Framework. Really, really important piece for us. I think, I know when Jessica, who's here, was working on this, she probably never realized at the time with Trasafox in ATU, in TUS at Lone Campus previously, what it would lead to in terms of how it was sustained. But I think the main words are we need to have leadership, we need to improve, we need to transition, we are helping, navigating into our education. All of the kind of things are identify, support, what was the other one? Respond, celebrate, collaborate. All of those things are key. We've heard them come through all the time. But no matter what, if we have frameworks that we can go back to, we can hang, I think it's really important that we take our data, what we have, and hang it back onto this and make sure it sits within a framework that we can actually evidence back to the HEA or wherever we want to go, who are funding our different initiatives. And I'm going to just summarise to say that young people live in complex, ever-changing worlds. And I think there's nothing else that's been evident today. We have high rates of anxiety and depression in our college students. Factors associated with anxiety and depression are complex. I mean, they are very much complex. We need to equip our students with the skills they need to navigate their way through difficult situations to achieve their potential. So again, let's not try and pathologize, let's put the right scaffolding in at the right time so that they can actually go on to achieve their potential. Their potential might be a 2-2, or it might be a first. What it is not important, it's their potential. It's also, we need to equip students with the skills to support their friends to signpost them. So like often friends, if we go back, we say, where they're going to go first is their friends. So if friends kind of know how, not that they take on the responsibility or hold somebody who might be distressed, but how do we make sure that our universities provide enough information that they can signpost out. And then we need to equip staff with the skills to support their students, to support them and appropriate as well. I think that came through as the importance of staff within all of this. And sometimes staff are afraid to actually have the conversation. They might be approached by somebody, they think they're distressed, and they're going, oh, I'm not a counsellor, I can't do that. So it's to give people that it's okay to have a conversation and giving them the right skills to do that. And I just thought I'd finish with quotes. So as a teenager, I struggled very much with my mental health and at times contemplated suicide. But by remaining optimistic about my future, which is quite important, and forcing myself to make progress in small steps, I grew stronger as a person. I was a male 21. And then I come from a family with much experience with depression, and I know too many people to count who suffer from depression, anxiety and self-harm. It is a scary world for this generation. That was a female who was 23. And then these are just some of we published quite a lot on student mental health in peer-reviewed journals that, if you're interested in more stuff. And obviously to acknowledge Amanda Fitzgerald, who I work really closely with, and Kieran Mann also was on this study, and thank you.